Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Carlos Aguirre, and I'm the interim director for the Center for Latino, Latina, and Latin American Studies. And thank you all for coming. Thank you to the museum for hosting this event. Thank you to Cheryl Harton, our Latin American Studies curator, for her wonderful work organizing the exhibit, and also the lecture that we are about to listen to. I hope many of you, most of you, have a chance to see the exhibit upstairs at some point on Cusco photography. I also want to thank Gabriela Martinez, the real director of class, for her support towards this event, and to the staff in the history department that made all the arrangements for our speaker. I'm really pleased to introduce my colleague and friend Jorge Coronado, who is a professor of modern Latin American and Andean literatures and cultures at Northwestern University, where he's also director of the program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. He's the author of a couple of books. The first one is The Andes Imagine, Indigenismo, Society and Modernity, published in 2009. And very recently, Portraits in the Andes, Photography and Agency, 1900-1950, published in 2018. He's also the co-editor of a forthcoming volume, Visiones de los Andes, Ensayos Críticos sobre el Concepto de Paisaje y Región. It's going to be published by Plural Editores in La Paz, Bolivia. And he never rests. He's working on two more book projects, a manuscript with the tentative title Lo Andino, Región, Cultura, Concepto, a book, an essay that explores how the region, the Andean region, has cohered in the cultural imagination since the early 19th century. And the other one is a project on letter practices produced by what he calls subaltern subjects in the early 20th century. Her presentation today, as you know, is titled The Meanings of Portrait Photography in the Andes, 1900-1950. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jorge Coronado.
Great, I think this is working. I wanted to first thank Carlos, of course. It's always a pleasure to visit a close colleague's home institution and find it so beautiful. Apparently, from all the exclamations of how great it is today, it's not always like this. I'm delighted to accept the invitation from Carlos Aguirre, who is an essential figure in our large field, and I'm very grateful also to the Center for Latinx and Latin American Studies, as well as Cheryl Hartrup and the Schnitzer Museum of Art for this invitation. It's always delightful to be able to share one's research. I wanted to say quickly that this is indeed part of the book that Carlos mentioned, and that book arose in relationship to my study of literature. I'm a scholar of literature. And the frustrations that I faced when I was studying literature and trying to understand the place of indigenous and mestizos, Indians, right? What's called Indians in English. Indigenous peoples and mestizos in that society and in means of representation, right? So this book comes very much out of that, that concern. So the archive of photographic images produced in the Andes in the first half of the 20th century is vast. In that archive, the representation of people in portraits, as opposed to other subject matter, accounts for the lion's share of images in the case of works done by professional photographers, whether in studio or not. By portraits, I mean a particular photographic practice as well as its formal result. One standard definition of portraiture along formal lines arises out of art history. I quote, "Portraits are artworks intentionally made of living or once living people by artists in a variety of media and for an audience. Portraits may survive as physical objects for a very long time, and their images may be transferred to other media and even replicated in vast numbers, with significant consequences in reception. In principle, however, only the audience is ill-defined at the time of the portrait's making, and it has unlimited potential for new appraisals of the person portrayed or for the generation of misunderstandings born of ignorance." Close quote. That's from Richard Brilliant, a very prominent art historian. While the definition in general holds for Andean photographs, I note that it is entirely dependent on the rarefication that the status of art object introduces into the idea of a portrait, and so undermines the notion both of audience, which in the case of Andean portraits may be anonymous, but can be identified as local and personal, and of the sitter's capability in determining the form and the very existence of the image. The latter slight occurs precisely because the notion of portrait as art privileges the idea, in this case, of the photographer as artist. But the definition of portraits should not simply be reduced to images of the artist's intention in showing an individual or group of sitters. For example, images 1 and 2 show subjects who are virtually the sole objects of the visual field, and yet they will not be considered as portraits under the rubric I elaborate here. These images, and many others like them, serve as an all-important foil for understanding what the potential and reality of portraiture practice in the Andes mean. Images such as these constitute the exterior of studio portraiture. They are not the only images that could potentially function in this way, as one could speak equally of the differentiation between studio portraits and landscape vistas, or images of business enterprises, two types of photographs that were also common at the time. However, images of Andeans such as these rest upon a particular management of the body as well as of human subjectivity. They are especially effective at revealing, by contrast, what it is that portraits do in order to articulate and communicate notions of self, community, and human society. Though both images 1 and 2 originate in different institutions, their purpose is the same. In the case of 1, the ends of the institution are aided by the typewritten text placed directly on the photograph. It expresses in writing what in a sense is already communicated by the photograph. The subject pictured, purportedly Evaristo Cayizaya, is a criminal, a ratero or thief in common parlance. His marginality is multiply communicated by his poor dress, by his disheveledness, by his phenotype, and also by his indigenous surname. The fact of the image taken in a format that is typical of the mugshot confirms this. The photograph comes from the Julio Cordera archive in La Paz. It is but one of many that Coronado produced for his occasional employers, the police. The image of Cayizaya shares a great deal with a photograph of the recruits taken in Cusco in the 1930s, thereabouts. Jose Gabriel Gonzalez's photograph was likely commissioned by the army or some other state institution. Its functions aligned with the Bolivian example. Images of multiple subjects, such as this one, were later cut up into smaller individual photographs that were used to identify the individuals pictured. Thus, these images serve to identify the people pictured therein for institutional monitoring purposes. While there are no names attached to the versions of these in Gonzalez's archive, we can surmise that, as in the case of Cayizaya, the pairing of such images with writing played a key part of how such photographs achieved their purpose. Furthermore, in both cases, the images were subsequently organized into institutional archives in which they took part in the formation of a series of similar images. They may have then appeared in identification card format, or ficha, as it's called in Spanish, as was the case in the photographs that Sebastián Rodriguez took for the Cerro de Pasco Mining Corporation. This is a ficha, like the actual card itself. This is the blow-up of the image there. I'm going to go back to this one. Images such as these share much informed content as well as intent with a long history of anthropological and criminological photography, such as that exemplified in the infamous French Croquis Montfort expedition to Bolivia of 1903, which sought to visually distill Bolivian man. There you go. In a sense, these three images allow us to understand how state surveillance functioned hand in hand with technologies of writing, a long-standing collaboration dating back to at least the instauration of the colonial regime in the region, and at a later point, the novel photographic technology. The relatively smaller size of the photograph on the ID card suggests that photography quickly became just another piece of information, albeit an indispensable one, in such practices, and that the visual register was one area through which such subjects could be submitted to taxonomical strictures. While only some of the information on the Cerro de Pasco Mining Corporation card can be verified in the image, notably such as skin color, they use the word trigueño, and race, indígena, the correspondence between image and writing is deeper. In sum, what the description does is boil down the human subject to all its pertinent dimensions as the institution understands it. That is, the image and the descriptors are meant to fully characterize the subject as a worker, recruit, or criminal as the essential information with respect to the person's role in society. The practice is a direct descendant of Bertillonage, a system of anthropometric measurement designed by the French anthropologist and criminologist Alphonse Bertillon. His system was instituted to classify bodies under French police after 1883, and as Gabriela Zamorano has described, it had a long-lasting impact in Latin America. Such images achieve an anti-portrait effect by first eliminating the context, real or imaginary, that portraits typically deploy. In the previous 5 images, the production of the visual field is organized so that there is barely any background visible, or rather, so that it is an undifferentiated field. You can go to this, for example. Although the González image contains the view of an adobe wall, the objective is clearly to equate that wall with the white blank sheet that is also being used as a background for the first row of sitters. Upon the cutting up and separating out of the individual subjects, any trace of real space would be difficult to perceive. This tendency toward the erasure of the significance of anything else in the visual field does not take place primarily in the service of emphasizing the subject or making him or her more important. On the contrary, the effect is one of stranding him or her without the symbolic supplements that are typical in portraits. Thus, and beyond the significance of the plain expressions that such identificatory images require, the sine qua non of such images remains the emptying out of all symbolic meaning that might be attached to things. To possess things, in the end, is to be in relationship to them and thus to demonstrate dominion over some aspect of reality. The goal of these photographs is precisely to deny such a relationality to the subjects pictured. It bears emphasizing that in the examples of identificatory photography given, the subjects are variously and in different degrees, but indubitably marked as indigenous. The images have been chosen in part because of this commonality, but it is incumbent upon analysis to observe that in images that involve institutions, a key way of identifying subjects mobilizes the dominant codes through which subjects are understood socially. In these images, both race and class stand out as primary organizing principles. The phenotypic aspect of the images is paramount. In the González image, as well as the Cordero mugshot, back to that, these markers are communicated variously through several physical qualities, such as skin color. Importantly, in the González group picture, a fundamental way in which the notions of both race and class are communicated is through the deindividuation on which the picture is based. That is, this image presents subjects in exactly the same posture, hair, and dress, all of about the same age. From it, one might easily begin to draw conclusions about a race rather than about a human community. There are no social relations visible among these subjects. And thus the image, ostensibly for the identification of army recruits, also draws on and disseminates pre-existing ideas of racial determination in a powerful new visual fashion. For instance, in the Cordero and Rodriguez pictures, and though the images are from distant regions of the Andes and 2 significantly different national contexts, Peru and Bolivia, it is striking how poverty of dress and disheveledness persist as markers of indigenous origin and class. So let me shift now to saying what portraits do. Portraits, on the contrary, create sense to the physical objects, including bodies, that populate the visual fields that they depict. Even those that have minimal background, such as Roberto Andrade Venegas' portrait of a bride and groom here, persist in locating significance in the subject's relation to the rest of the image. In this case, the newly married couple could not be photographed in a more Spartan space, which may serve to emphasize the relative sumptuousness of their dress, particularly that of the bride. Nevertheless, even the bare floor and scratched-up wall that lies behind them have a fundamental significance in the image. Those markers of architectural dimensions allow the viewer to understand them as occupying one space, which is moreover reiterated by their physical contact. The image is very much one of presentation. The pose of the two figures is one that takes advantage of the space around them in order to exceed it, in order to both differentiate themselves from it at the same time that it communicates a relationship of distinction from its plainness. Moreover, in the case of all such pictures, and against interpretation that would understand them as art objects, photographic portraiture has a decidedly distinguishing characteristic. It produces haptic artifacts, that is, of touch. The quality of being haptic allows us to imagine the existence of these portraits in the literal hands of others through human touch. As Tina Kampt has written, quote, "Haptic images are objects whose effects are structured by a tripartite sense of touch, indexical touch, a physical touch, and an affective touch," close quote. The concrete, palpable physicality of such images is interestingly voided in institutional contexts, like the images we saw before. It is precisely in their circulation among hands and bodies of Andeans that we must frame the significance of these images. They are meant to inhabit reduced areas and intimate spaces of what is typically called the private sphere and can also be called domestic space. At most, and thinking synchronically, the portraits are meant to be viewed by immediate family members and close social relations. The number of viewers typically falls over time, as photographs have less relevance for viewers who may not personally know the pictured, languish in photo albums that no one sees, or otherwise become hidden away from sight. Given these small audiences for individual viewers, then, the numbers of portraits produced in the Andes is extraordinary. Briefly, photographic studios such as Julio Cordero's estimate 80,000 individual images in its collection today, which is likely only a fraction of the images taken over the period that the studio was in operation. Similarly, Martin Chambi's studio in Cusco reportedly contains 65,000 to 100,000 individual images. Both of these studios were long-lived and were well-placed within principal cities. Even if we consider that many of the negatives represent images that were not to be used because of defect or preference, an average of 2,000 photos per year, which we calculate only from the images that remain, signals a sizable weekly production. And it must not be forgotten that these images were subject to multiple copies. Indeed, it would be rare that they be sold in single prints, as reproducibility was one of their primary attractions. Portraits such as image 7 of two miners in the town of Morococha stand as persuasive proof that portraiture's wide dissemination inflected the representation of subjects in private space. The importance of this fact cannot be overstated, as it marks the first time in the history of Latin America that the world that marginal subjects were able to acquire, but also tailor, technically produced images of themselves. The reasons they had this access had to do with the cheapening of the technology and the materials required for it, as well as the expansion of the market, both in terms of consumers as well as practitioners. Practically, then, we can understand photography in its early stages, including versions such as daguerreotypes, which allowed only the creation of a unique image, but also other photographic technologies like the ambrotype and the calotype, to have become a paragon of reproducibility only when access to the technology was had by significant parts of the world's population. That is, reproducibility is a market effect as much as it is a technical innovation. This mass distribution as a sort of going native of studio practice is precisely what is at stake in the transformation of the norms of portraiture within Andean images. For example, image 7 demonstrates, perhaps first and foremost, an extreme comfort of the subjects before the camera lens, and, it must be said, with the prospect of having their picture taken. That comfort although it does not require previous experience of what is happening in the studio, does necessitate the capacity to imagine what that experience can be when it is understood as quotidian. That is, these subjects project an understanding of the moment of image taking as one that is at their disposal, rather than one that subordinates them to the dictates of the technology and the processes through which it is enacted. If we think back to the images that were taken under the dictates of the institutional setting and state requirements, then we perceive that the situation is exactly opposite there. Those sitters are being subjected both to the technology and through it to state and institutional practices. It is not so much that we can read this in their faces or postures. Rather, in those cases, it is the institution's molding power that is itself visible on their faces. And I'm arguing that this is not at all the case here, right? This is not to say that power is not visible in image 7 as well. However, its effect is not subordination. Rather, wielded in some degree by the men pictured, it allows them to present themselves in a comfortable masculinity with which they identify and which they possess in the photo and likely possess in relation to their subalterns, women, children, other men, in daily life. However, where in the case of identificatory photographs, power can be reduced to its effects on the presentation of human subjects, within the photographs such as these, portrait's power has quite a different contour. In these images, it is productive of human bonds of society and community to the creation of subaltern subjects' own record. For example, image 8 also abundantly makes visible complex human bonds. In this sense, these images are always documentary through the method of invention, that is, as elaborate compositions which strive to communicate the reality in which they are immersed. Sebastián Rodríguez's portrait of a rural family in the mining town of Morococha was clearly staged by either the photographer, the sitters, and both, and yet it portrays effectively the reality of indigenous peoples' adaptation to industrializing and extractivist centers like Morococha. The portrait contains 7 figures, presumably from the same family, though the relationships of kinship between some are not clear. Are these perhaps 2 couples from the same community? While the women have almost identical clothing on and wear it in the same way, the men have a greater variation in their dress. They have different hats on. One wears overalls while the other does not. The women seem to have wedding bands on, but the men's hands show no such sign. The children are grouped toward the couple on the right and are perhaps their issue. Given the primness of those photographed, in particular the women whose clothing arrangement is impeccable, down to the traditional pins, it remains highly meaningful that the photograph is taken outside on a city street rather than in a home. Is the structure behind them such a place? If so, it seems to represent some sort of barracks, as the doorways are numbered individually. While the given title is Family Arriving in Morococha, and we can talk about titles later, but they're very much that. They're just given, right? It hardly seems to be possible that this is the case from the photographic evidence. The cleanliness and order of the clothes and shoes, plus the composure of all those involved, with the hair recently combed, hats just so, would indicate a portrait that was purposefully made at this site, and with the significant goods included. Beyond the clothing of these goods, 5 stand out. If I can figure out how. 5 stand out. First and foremost, the boy near the center of the photograph proudly displays a mechanical timepiece, a wind-up clock complete with alarm bell. There it is. If it is accurate, then the time is about 10:45 in the morning. To his immediate right, the little girl, who is the most poorly dressed in a tattered apron, holds forth what seems to be either a porcelain or tin dish, which is right there. Right? Immediately behind them, an older man gently props up a miner's lamp with his left hand and displays its unlit bell, right there. The woman to the right, his right, displays an ornate pin that holds together her shawl, right there. Finally, with less evident calculation, the leftmost man holds a piece of paper in his left hand. Right? Are these attributes we are to associate to each individual or to the group? The image strongly conveys a sense that each of these items articulates not just the group as a whole, but rather how the ways in which these bears or particular aspects of life in the modernizing Andes come together to survive as a family. Thus, the indispensable tool of work that is the miner's lamp is held up as a prime attribute of the breadwinner, while the other man in the image communicates that he is at least aware of the importance of writing in this non-rural setting. Whether the paper contains identification information, instructions, or some other details, it matters most that enough importance be placed on this key instrument of power in Andean society that it be included in the image. The little girl forcefully displays a tin dish, which is a valuable possession that likely stands in for others. Importantly, she wears the same sort of shawl as the two women, and the holding of the plate seems to cement the notion that she is a wife in the making. Her domesticity is foretold. The woman's pin, again, the pin and the clock, which I'm about to talk about a little more. The woman's pin and the boy's clock hold a wealth of information about this group's hopes and dreams. Either or perhaps both in conjunction could be thought of as the photograph's punctum, to use and redefine slightly the French theorist Roland Barthes' term for that part of the photograph that is its linchpin, its like center, right? While Barthes deploys that notion to speak of an intensive individualized attachment to a particular photograph, and so attempts to signal a single person's experience of an image, here we might speak of a historical punctum, or one that resonates not primarily with individual tastes and expectations, but rather with the commonality of a lived experience. As such, this image's historical punctum would lie in the tension, but also cohabitation of the pin and the clock. Both are items of value and prestige, albeit in different ways. The pin, known as a tupu in Quechua, and typically adorned with an animal at its head, is cast in metals such as silver or some amalgam of it and communicates the world of handicraft. Importantly, it also leaves evidence of the sorts of complex markets in which indigenous peoples have traded goods and services for centuries. The placement of the pin prominently at the center of the body demonstrates its value and significance. It symbolizes traditional wealth and rural culture. The clock, as we have noted, embodies the new, the urban, and all that has to do with the odyssey of the city. Its placement, too, is crucial as it hangs towards the center of the photograph and thus has some prominence. But perhaps what is most revealing about its presence lies in the boy who has been made to hold it. This boy, part of the family, nevertheless already looks like a miniature worker, and indeed, given the presence of children in the mines at Morococha, perhaps he already is. He wears the appropriate clothes for mining. Whatever the case, his holding of the clock strongly stresses this family's notion that the future lies with him and his labor, but also his capacity to possess modernity, that is, to grasp a future in the new context in which they find themselves. In sum, the photographer's and the family's work in articulating this image emphasizes the integrity of the unit and the need to picture it as such, coherent and unified. Undoubtedly, it is a portrait that in some measure helps to negotiate the destabilizing novelties of modernization. A prime example of another such novelty is the display of women in these photographs. As we have seen, women relate to both present and absent masculine figures, either visible or invisible, and the images serve to intensify their traditional roles, whether as mother, as wife, or some other form of standard bearer of tradition and the hearth. However, portraits from this period also capture the erosion of the traditional place of women and the construction of new roles and dynamics in which they exist. Predictably, they do so in ways that are both subtle and strident, depending on the portrait's subjects and circumstances. Images 9 through 11 are but 3 examples, and they range from the Central Andes to the south. Image 9 by Julio Cordero shows a couple in La Paz sometime after 1924. The portrait was clearly prepared for circulation among family and friends, as it seems to have been produced in multiple copies and with a costlier cardboard framing that carried the name of the prestigious studio. It was taken in Cordero's La Paz studio and displays the telltale hallmarks of that space: the furniture, the background, as well as the light-colored wooden floor flanks. I spent a lot of time in the studio, so this is about that space. The portrait is an extraordinary organization of dark and light effects mapped across the 2 subjects. The seated man is a study in black clothing, while his counterpart, presumably his wife, as the band on the third finger of her right hand would indicate, is clad almost entirely in white, as if in direct counterpoint. Surely, some previous planning concerning the effect of clothing choice in such an image had to have taken place, perhaps even in concert with the photographer. Note the details of the gloves and shoes. While the shoes follow the assignment of color by gender, the gloves are switched. That is, they break with the color coding, presumably to add emphasis. The studious use of these two colors in a black and white photograph naturally shapes, too, the relation that is figured therein. First and foremost, the color choices strongly differentiate the two figures who already exist within the binary of husband, wife, male, female. In other images, that binary has presupposed an assignation of hierarchy that organizes the relations between subjects, and this is also the case here. Clearly, the shifting cultural object understood as indigeneity is assigned to the female in terms of her dress, and most probably by her striking phenotypical features which stand out more starkly against her husband's. Nevertheless, it is useful to remember that in the Bolivian case, as the historian Rosana Barragan has suggested, the particular visual markers that this woman carries, which lead to her identification as a chola, which has a particular meaning in the Bolivian context, which it doesn't have in the Peruvian context, do not necessarily designate her as subaltern in this particular society, or at least not as the same sort of subaltern as in other parts of the Andes. Indeed, a close reading of the portrait seems to, at the very least, attenuate any notion that this representation projects a rigid top-down inequality among the two figures. The photograph echoes a wedding portrait in which the dress and color scheme is similar. However, unlike such images, there is no physical contact between the two. And while the man does assume the position of prominence and authority in being seated, it is attenuated due to the fact that his mass seems minimal in the portrait, which may be an effect of the lack of strong contrast between him and the background. As such, the woman stands up ramrod straight and forcefully, and her body language projects independence and maybe resolve. Her hand, for instance, rests on the seat but does not require it for support. Rather, it is there because it highlights her stately figure. But body language is not all. Curiously, the woman holds her purse in one hand, its dark outline clearly visible on her white dress. Coupled with the fact that the dress she wears is that of the merchant women of La Paz, who assumed a position of social prominence because of their financial independence as early as the 19th century, then at minimum, what the photograph offers is the image of two people who are not necessarily reliant one upon the other. For the man, this is of course significant. In the case of the woman, it is more so. Images such as the Cabrera's portrait of a couple at the Incan ruin of Sacsayhuaman above Cusco, further nuance, image 10, further nuance this terrain of shifting gender dynamics. In it, a woman sits and a man stands next to her, holding her shawl or another that looks very similar to the one that is draped around her. The image is roughly coetaneous to Cordero's portrait, but departs from many of the standards of portraiture. For example, as indeed was typical for the Cabreras, the portrait is shot outside using the backdrop of the monumental stones at the Inca fortress. However, unlike many images of such ruins, they are not clearly identifiable as such because the closeness of the camera to its subjects has obscured the site, the larger site, right? Further, whereas in images such as Cordero's, the whitening of the face of the woman is clearly evident from the contrast in color between her hands and her face, the glass plate negatives used by the Cabreras here visualize richly colored skin, almost bronze in its variety of hues. Indeed, the skin colors resonate with the shadings of the stone behind these subjects, and as such establish a visual connection between ruins and human subjects. The relationship between the man and the woman is harder to establish here. Husband, brother, some sort of relative, even the notion that he is an employee comes to mind because of the way in which, in the space of the photograph, he seems clearly secondary. His clothing, while clean, is nowhere near as ornate as her embroidered shawl, her print skirt and top, her shiny jewelry, and finely bordered hat. Furthermore, while overall she seems to be a parallel figure to the one imaged in the Cordero portrait, Cusco and certainly Peru did not have a similar long-standing tradition of the public figure of the chola. Perhaps the closest figure here is the chichera, as expressed in Maria Arguedas's Los Ríos Profundos, The Deep Rivers, a canonical novel from the 20th century in Peru, and as studied in the work of the anthropologist Mary Weismantel. On the whole, these were subversive figures in that tradition, rather than fixtures in urban society and its imaginary. The policies in place against their businesses, mainly through sanitary legislation, are well documented in the work of anthropologist Marisol de la Cadena. Thus, the figure in this photograph enjoys a new social space within the society of Cusco. Curiously, this place seems to include the presence of a man who acts as a porter to her. Do the shawls constitute her wealth and livelihood? And is an attribute much in the way that subaltern figures function in other photographs. Sebastián Rodríguez's portrait of a seamstress, and I'm closing here. Sebastián Rodríguez's portrait of a seamstress is contemporary to the first two in this grouping, but comes from the considerably smaller town of Morococha. Similarly shot outside, and one would assume, given the cumbersomeness of the sewing machine, not too far from where the woman practiced her profession, if indeed she is a seamstress, the photograph takes to an extreme the protagonism of the woman in relation to her male counterpart. The woman's body, bedecked with jewelry, as well as the lavish clothing that certainly could not have been daily wear, takes up the large part of the visual plane, and her seated stability is absolute, with her hands seemingly effortlessly holding in place the sewing machine. The comb that holds in place her hair radiates from the top of her head like a crown. The photograph is rich in details, including a sharp conveyance of the machine itself, which is as ornate as its mass-produced ironwork, as the woman's clothing, and by virtue of being a singer, is an import to boot. It is spooled, and the white string is being used on the piece of cloth she handles. And perhaps the photograph tells too much. It records both her weary, if determined gaze, as well as the deep wrinkles in her forehead. She is not a beginner at her trade. To the background left, there is a passive, almost effaced man, whose presence is such that he does not even face the camera. Rather, he reads and looks askance towards the lens. Reading in the Andes is a powerful skill, as I've mentioned, and yet in this photograph, that skill seems to be subsumed under her gaze, all the more so because what the man reads seems to be a ledger of some sort. Perhaps, as in the case of the Cabrera's portrait, the man here works in some corollary fashion, in reality or symbolically or both, to the woman. In the end, he looks like he could well be her accountant. Strikingly, both the man's darkness as well as the position of his body is echoed by a rooster, which you can see right here. Is echoed by a rooster at the lower right of the visual field, tellingly a rooster that is tethered by its leg, by his leg. As is the case to varying degrees in a majority of such portraits, Image 11 is immersed in a discourse that involves race, gender, geopolitical occasion, and other cornerstones of modern subjectivity. If they play on any terrain, these portraits attempt to project an identity, and they may do so differently for the same subject. That is to say, before anything else, identity manifests as a performance, in the sense that Judith Butler has given the term in her development of the notion of gender as a fiction. As she proposes, quote, "If the notion of an abiding substance is a fictive construction produced through the compulsory ordering of attributes into coherent gender sequences, then it seems that gender as substance, the viability of man and woman as nouns, is called into question by the dissonant play of attributes that fail to conform to sequential or causal models of intelligibility," close quote. Butler's notion is especially helpful in this context because it allows a movement away from a causal relationship between an essential identity and the expressions of it, in this case visual, which the former occasions. Because, quote, "gender proves to be performative, it is always a doing," close quote. That's Butler. While Butler here refers to normative gender identities, clearly the possibility for the introduction of non-normative performance into standardized gender roles arises. In these photographs, then, Andean culture offers tools through which these subjects, through identitarian strategies, moor themselves in their contemporary moment. The projection of this identity through the visual medium of photography and portraiture embodies one of the very bases of agency as we understand it in such images. As we consider some of the ways in which such an identity is enunciated, it bears stressing that in no way does it constitute an option where portraiture is concerned. That is to say, a corollary of the desire and will to be photographed, to speak nothing of the financial wherewithal to have this done, is that once entered into the visual fields under the auspices of portraiture, there is no choice but to project an identity. In my view, this is the most essential definition of portraiture itself. Naturally, a variety of vocabularies exist through which these notions of self and the world can be communicated, and perhaps one of the most important tensions, above and beyond the complex notions of race, gender, ethnicity, age, etc., that we have gestured to, is constituted by the difficulties of alterity as defined in the historical context of the Andes. To no small extent, the photographic field of portraiture is precisely the space in which a majority of modern Andeans were able, early in the 20th century, to begin to engage this central and shared problematic. Thank you. Let me say briefly that there were many images, and one of the ones that came up, this is a wonderful one, that came up with Cheryl are these cross-dressing ones that also exist in the, and they clearly have to do with this argument I was just making, but one only has so much time for certain images. But they're also within the visual record, and they gesture to this sort of pliability that I was talking about, especially with respect to women, right, in this moment. Let me go back. Yeah. Oh, right, and I'm supposed to ask for questions and answers, which I'm very happy to field. Yes, in the back.
Thank you so much. That's very
Right.
enlightening and great presentation. And related to this last set of questions that you have
Yes.
forward about the fluidity of gender representations, I wonder whether in your work on Bambino and this, the relation with this other type of sort of exegesis of photography that you're doing, whether you've been able to sort of point towards the origin of the use of the bowling hat by females in particular. I know it's a very sort of widely used sort of form of attire, but that can be dated, I think, to the mid-19th century and to English influences right in the Andes. But it's particularly notable that it's women that display that otherwise male piece of garment.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a very specific question for which I don't have an answer. The issue around the ways in which particular sorts of clothing is used in the Andes is indeed, right, historically determined to particular moments. These are not trans-historical things, right? They arise in certain moments, quite often in the context of colonialism, as you know, right? The bowler hat, right, and how exactly it's imported would be a great question for somebody who studies clothing, right? And there may be somebody like that in this room, but I don't know the exact right answer to that, right? Yes?
Thank you for talking about that. Really quite interesting and compelling. I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit more about how it is that the role of digitizing slides has made possible different kinds of scholarship, of looking and of thinking about these artworks, many of which are known to us, known to you, right? Presumably through prints that have been made within the last decade. And so sort of like, what happens to the haptic nature of photography? Are there new ways of touching? Should we include like sliding a mouse as a way of touching that now helps us?
That's a great question.
So something just about that stuff.
Yeah, well, that's a lot, and it's a wonderful question. And in fact, the last chapter of my book is kind of about that. So I can relate something that may begin to answer this, and we can kind of think about it a little bit further. In one of so this took a while to put together in terms of archives, but in one of the trips that I made, I went to a town where I have family relations, and every town of a certain size, right? Let's say 5,000, right? In the first half of the 20th century, likely had a photographer or an itinerant photographer, right? That went through, right? So, you know, after a while, I kind of thought, well, I could just go to any town and ask for the photographer. So I went to this town, I asked for the photographer, and indeed, they said, yes, of course. You know, Roberto Andrade Venegas, that one of those photographs that you saw. His photographic studio was in the La Pampa, which is one of their plazas. You know, it used to be in that big house there. I think that's owned by La Señora Luján Castillo, right? So go find her. And I found La Señora Luján Castillo. And interestingly, I sat with her. She was already very old. And I said, where's the archive? And she said, it's right here. And she brought it out, and there were maybe, I don't know, 100 photographs, 80 photographs. And I said, is this it? And she said, yes. And I said, there had to have been more. And she said, oh, yes, there have been many. And as we were talking, people started coming in and asking her for photographs. And so she would sell the photographs, right, to people who were coming in, quite often family members, right? So I found, as a scholar of photography, my first reaction was, oh my God, she's destroying the archive. But on the other hand, as a scholar of photography, I also realized that one of the things she was doing was making these objects circulate in ways that were very different. This town is in Ayacucho, which went through a period of great violence from 1980 to 2000, if not longer. So what I surmised was that one of the functions of the photograph was to kind of help in reconstituting images of family, because quite often that was what was happening. People would come in and say, oh, do you have a picture of my uncle? And she would say, yes, I think somewhere there's one of them. And in fact, it's in here, but she said, when I came in, she said to me, I have a picture of your grandfather. And she pulled it out, and I was kind of taken aback, right? And she made me take it, right? Right, the way that answers your question, or begins to, is that there's many different ways of dealing with the haptic objects that are photographs. Our kind of first instinct, by which I mean scholars, is to preserve them in libraries and in museums, right? But often what that means is removing them from the communities within which they sit, right? And within which they have a very different sort of meaning. So one of the things that we do when we put them in archives, I have nothing against putting them in archives. I myself have been responsible for this sort of thing. I'm just saying, though, one of the things that we do is we make them unavailable quite often to that other sort of circulation, right? So that being said, one of the options that I think has been really important for scholarship has been digitizing, right? And making available these sorts of objects in different formats, in different spaces, even with all the problems that entails, right? Precisely because in some cases, as I understand is the case with Rosana Barragan, who I mentioned, right? She started a project in Bolivia where apparently what they have done is they got a bus and they started scanning family portraits in different towns in the Andes and allowing people to keep their photographs, right? But she would just kind of scan them and use them, right, for these ends. I've never seen it. It's in the Biblioteca Nacional in Sucre, right? But apparently this is a project that she's taken on, right? This allows for, I guess, a sort of dual circulation or dual use of images, right? Other problems that are related with this, we were discussing with Cheryl Hartrup with this wonderful exhibit you have up on the second floor. We were discussing that when Edward Rani, who was the first scholar of Chambi, when he was asked, I think it's the 70s, to do a show on Chambi at the MoMA said, these images are beautiful. Beautiful is the code word for art. They said, we have to make them really big. And Ronnie fought that tooth and nail because he said, they're postcards. He said, the images are, their use is postcards. They're not these huge, things that you hang on the wall as art, right? That being said, I think it's important to understand that the objects can be art. But once they're moved into these sorts of spaces, they obviously assume a very different function, which is not to be confused with that other function that they have out there. It's kind of an obvious thing, but I think it's important to kind of keep it in mind. So your question goes to those many, right? There are many, many different topics there. But you are absolutely right. These things come to us through a variety of technological reproductions now, right? Yeah. Yes, there's a question in the back, and then a question here.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Hi, thank you.
Sure.
Earlier you mentioned that you kind of account for this this place where the photographer is framing the subject, or you account for this this place where there's another subject present outside of the image. I was wondering how you account for yourself as the reader of an image, because presumably there's a power dynamic within what is made visible to us and what's invisible. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
That's a good question. So you're asking me to theorize my own position as a scholar with relationship to the image. Well, there's many things one could say about that, right? You could take, so in the first case, absolutely. In fact, that's one of the main points of the book. That is to say, to think about what agency means, right? I think one of the tendencies is to think that photographs are produced by photographers. I think that is the case if it's, certain kinds of photographs, let's say, but not these sorts of studio portraitures. From what I've seen, right, in these sorts of images, there are clear indications through posture, right, through dress, through body language related to posture, through settings, also through, I think we have here, this is why this one's here, this wonderful image which shows us to what extent, there's a boy here, he's been erased. Right? His foot is down here. Right? It's not the Carnero's foot. There's all sorts of modifications like this that happen in these images. There's tons of them. There's different ways in which they're modified. It can be on the actual image, often on the glass plate, on the negative, right? So there's a sort of agency that occurs that's between the photographer and the subject, right? And it's a sort of, it's tricky to think about because it has to happen as a collaboration. There's another way of thinking that through, right? In terms of my relationship to the images, I mean, which way do you want me to go? You want me to go super negative or positive? I mean, I'm a North American academic, right, who sits in a very privileged institution and thinks about visual cultural history, right? And in part, I've established my career, right, on that, right? So that's to be considered and taken very seriously. In part, my hope is that, right, if that is a dynamic, and I have no doubt that in part it is, my hope in doing this sort of work is that these sorts of images, which are so rich in telling us, right, the history, the culture, the society of a moment, right, that this sort of work allows these sorts of images to be further preserved, right? So if I'm going to take perhaps the most negative, maybe not the most negative reading of what that possible relation is, I hope that there's also an upside to it. For me, that's important in the case of these images, all of them, I mean, right, even ones I haven't studied, because there are so many that have already been lost, and because there are so many that we will never have access to. Many of them have been traded into the market for just to be sold one by one. Others have been simply destroyed, right? It's very common for people to say, oh yeah, there was a photographer here, but he died, and who knows what happened to his stuff, right? So my hope is that agency cuts both ways, right? My agency cuts both ways in relationship to those images. Thanks for the question. There was one back there.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
And thank you very much. Very thought-provoking. Along the same lines, actually, about agency.
Yes.
And the agency of the photographer. And I understand the photographer as artist and situating and setting up a frame and presenting an image. And I'm wondering how much of that was consciously a capturing of a story that through the course of the various photographers' experience and artwork or oeuvre, how much they actually intentionally thought they might be creating a particular archive.
Yeah.
It couldn't have just been business, is my thought, but that there was some way in which they knew that they were doing us something.
Yeah, I think that's very possible. I mean, I think you have different ways in which photographers thought of themselves from the extant evidence, right? There is enough photographs, especially when it's interesting. When photographers were more financially successful, they tended to also portray themselves as artists in images, right? So Martín Chambi and Julio Cordero have these images where they're posing with what's this called? Thank you. Yeah, a palette with oil, right? Things, and they're kind of painting, and there's a photograph next to them, right? I don't have them right here, but they're well known. So there are images in which you have open calls to this notion of artist to be identified with the photographer, right? However, just as you have those, you have others where you don't have any of that, or at least I haven't seen any evidence of it, right? I remember there's a huge swath of photographers, and they go from the very high-class photographers to people who, like the Cabreras, could barely make a living, right? Like these guys, actually. I say these guys because Crisanto and Filiberto, his brother, are generally understood to take photographs together. Sometimes it's just Crisanto who's identified, but often it's both of them. So they could barely make a living, right? That being said, I don't see why what you're proposing wouldn't be the case, but I don't see why it would have to be the case. That is to say, photography at this moment is an artisanal. It's like getting shoes ordered, right? It's like, make me a suit, right? It's something where the person is working for clients and has to please the client's tastes, right? So I would think that one could think about what you're proposing, which is a photographer who is interested in creating a particular visual story, right? And an artisan who's interested in meeting consumer demands, right? Those two things can coincide, right? I don't see why not. However, I don't have clear evidence that there was photographers who were doing exactly what you're saying, which is creating one particular story, right? If anything, they were doing many different sorts of things, like also creating tourist postcards, right, at the same time, or engaging in archaeological photography, et cetera, right?
I was really just wondering about whether there was anything that they might have written about their own self-reflection.
More images, there's very little. There is, in the case of Martin Chambi, interviews, right, where he thinks about himself as an artist, right? He's probably the best example, right? Julio Cordero, his grandson, who I interviewed, told me similar things, right? But nothing extensive. And in fact, one of the shames about photography is that there's very little of a written record left around it, right? Quite often it's just the images that are valorized. The business records, which are fascinating, are usually gone, right? Cordero has a full set, which is amazing. Oh,
Okay,
sorry.
thank you.
I think there's
Thank you for
there's a question there, and then there's one here.
I got the mic. So. Well, thanks for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I was trying to make a connection with the painting of the 17th century in the Andes. There are many paintings where you see an indigenous people, not only a Virgin or Christ or whatever religious painting, but in the middle of a procession, we have an indigenous people. How does an Indian get to be in a painting that goes to the church? Because they have money. They can pay for the painting. So I'm thinking that many of these people that shows up in this portrait, is because they can pay the money to have a portrait taken of them. So there is this double connection of agency, both in the guys in the picture as well as in the photographer itself.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that what you're pointing out is exactly correct. Clearly, it has to do with economic wherewithal. And indeed, the fact that one could walk into a studio and say, you know, I have cinco soles, I have $5 soles, $5 take my picture. That is an enormous, that means a huge amount, right? I mean, because that's what this is about, which is selling this particular object. That's the case, right, all over the Andes at the beginning of the 20th century. Interestingly, we don't have these sorts of images from the middle to late 19th century. You begin to see them at the end of the 19th century, but the daguerreotype and other sorts of technologies are much more expensive, right? So, that puts a very high level of access to the images. Even though, in fact, there was a studio in Lima before there was a studio in Berlin, right? People started taking pictures there before Germany, right? So it's very quick, right, to come to Latin America. But yes, that's absolutely spot on. Yeah. Yes. I don't have a mic, so she needs a mic. Yeah. Oh, here, I do have a mic. Yeah. Yes. Sure.
So just a bit of commentary, if I may. So there is a tradition in the history of photography of portraiture of the working class. And if you look at the Western tradition, and particularly in the post-Civil War recession era, there was great pride in having a job, as well as having and being represented with the dress and tools of your trade, which we subsequently see with August Sander and, of course, Irving Penn. So when I look at these, I see an economic picture. They are doing well and can afford to have their picture taken in a studio with the representation of their labor.
That's great. The extent to which well can be understood. This image is good for what you're talking about, in part because there's a lot of studies, and Carlos, of course, would know most about this, but there's a classic study done by a very famous Peruvian historian, Flores Galindo, Alberto Flores Galindo, about the mines at Morococha, right? And so, these subjects, and he actually uses some of the, not this one, but he uses other photographs from this collection. The fact that they can access these materials has to do with the fact that indeed they have access to a different sort of economy, right? And the services like photography that are available within that economy and space. But and quite often they're obligated to work there. It's not like they're rolling in money or anything, right? But quite often this is sort of the first thing that they get, right? And the significance of that, I think, is really kind of overwhelming. In part because what it communicates is that the photographs allow for a different imagination of the self, right? That I'm sure was possible in other ways, right? But is perhaps particularly succinct or articulate, I guess, right? In these sorts of images, right? So what I mean is, it's not that there's lots of surplus wealth, right? It's that this is just a really important thing to have, right? With the wealth that you have.
And pride in your labor.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And also, I mean, in this case, there's lots of stuff going on. They're no longer indigenous, right? There's this thing about, I mean, from their perspective, there's this thing in the Andes. If you move from the rural to an urban space and you occupy a different sort of economy, that effectively changes, right, who you are in the sense of, right, indigenous, mestizo. So that obviously is also going on here, in my view. Yes?
In the course of your research, did you come across any candid or many non-studio photographs, street photography, that sort of thing?
I did come across street photography, but not much candid photography. That may be because I was looking for mostly studio photography. There are, I can't remember there are instances where I saw different format images, especially from later on, when cameras became smaller and that sort of thing became easier to do. But I wouldn't say that they were preponderant, right? Certainly I came across some, I can't remember what archive, but yes, right? There were some there, but not a lot.
Nobody that would equate to something like Matthew Brady, who took on the expense of doing it himself.
Right.
Didn't collect money from the state.
Yeah, well, there were people like that. One very notable figure is Juan Manuel Figueroa Aznar, right? From this period, I think if you look at a later period, you'll find lots of that, lots of different stuff. Juan Manuel Figueroa Aznar is upstairs in some of the images there. He married into a landowning family, and he was an artist, so he kind of had an aristocratic background. So he didn't, his main function his main use of photography was not to make a living, right? So there you get art photography because he was an artist, right? And you also get lots of family pictures of his own family, and that's certainly a different mode, right? It's a different kind of production. So that does exist in the record. Any other questions?
One more. Yes. Well, this is a really simple one.
Yep.
Is there any way you can speculate at all on why the boy was enriched in this photo?
Oh, sure. So when I was speaking to, so I saw this a lot, and there's different sorts of modifications. The classic modification is the whitening of the skin, right? I mean, I have pictures of my family with whitened skin. It just happened until very, very late in the 50s and 60s, right? But the classic reason why this was done, I mean, was to control, right, the representation of the family, right, or of the subject, right. The boy may have simply been somebody they just didn't want to have in the image, right, just somebody who either interloped in or they thought it was a good idea when they took the picture, but then afterwards were like, well, no, why is he there? Let's take him out, right. Another classic one is a well-known image of Carnival in Cusco by Martin Chambi, right. And it shows all the revelers, right? And if you look at it carefully, you don't really see it at first, but there's a figure that's kind of scratched out in the middle, right? And I saw that, and I asked Chambi, so what happened there? And he said, oh, that guy, Mr. So-and-so, he had been out at Carnival and he'd been drinking, right? And he was out and he was partying with everybody. And the next day, Chambi's habit in the middle of Cusco, where his studio was in the downtown, was to put the images in a vitrine, in a glass case, right, to show his work as it was coming along. And this guy happened by and he saw it, and he went in and he said, "I told my wife I was somewhere else, right, at that particular moment," right? He said, "You have to destroy that, like, on the negative. It cannot be found ever, right, that I was at that party," right? So that would indicate, right, that there were personal interests in terms of the representation of self or how one understands oneself in one's social space. That's an anecdote, but I think it's very effective at kind of indicating just how much personal taste played into image making, right, at this point.
Nobody here will be raised from the... So, thank you very much, Jorge. Please join me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Hombre.